tarde.
Good afternoon.
Boa tarde. Okay, everybody's here.
Thank
Muito
you
obrigado
for being here for this first chapter of Diálogos Cruzados, cross dialogues between the Foundation of Serralves and also the House of Architecture.
E a Casa da Arquitectura. Torno de duas fantásticas
with two amazing exhibitions of two Pritzker architects that, oddly enough, share the same city and the same building of their atelier, Álvaro Siza and Eduardo Souto de Moura. And this is also a very peculiar occasion because we have under the same roof two different titles, which is Serralves and House of Architecture. Something more than the architectural minds that are more important and creative of our days. This project has these two institutions involved that, although being different, they share the same goals in the pursuit of excellence. I'm very happy with this cooperation. The institutions share and work together and with a complementary to them. Thank you, House of Architecture, Nuno Sampaio, for this cooperation that I hope it's the first of a long series.
Now, this is what's going to happen. I will translate for you what I just said. Because I understood. I don't know about you. Tomorrow, in the context of the exhibition Souto de Moura, Memory Project Works at Casa da Arquitectura, architect Álvaro Siza will discuss the work of Eduardo Souto de Moura with curator Francesco Dal Co at 4 o'clock. Tonight, because we're really trying to confuse the audience, so Eduardo Souto de Moura comes here to talk about Siza. Siza goes to Casa da Arquitectura to talk about Souto de Moura. I'm sure something is going to happen. But tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome here Professor Kenneth Frampton and architect Eduardo Souto de Moura to discuss the work of Álvaro Siza. I'm of course very grateful to the curators of the exhibition, Carlos Muro and Nuno Grande, for seducing Kenneth Frampton, whose expertise and words have framed the history of modern architecture, to come to Porto and to Serralves to help us celebrate excellence in architecture. I am, of course, extremely grateful to Álvaro Siza and Eduardo Souto de Moura for being here and indulging in our endless thirst to learn from them. Now, please, I would like to welcome Carlos Moore, the co-curator of the exhibition, to come to this podium and introduce, if need be, our panelists. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Boa tarde, boa noite, bom fim de semana. Carlos.
Muito boa tarde, bem-vindos.
Good afternoon and welcome.
Bem-vindos também e
welcome to this first session of Diálogos Cruzados. Let me speak in English for Kenneth Frampton.
So I'm really delighted to be here tonight in this first session of the cross dialogues, cross conversations. Those of you who know me a little bit since I started doing some work here at Serralves will already know that I love conversations, that I love dialogues. I really think it's not just a pleasure to have two smart people talking, but conversation, I understand, it's a true form of knowledge, or even better, of knowledge production, which is very suitable, particularly for architecture, in many different ways. We've discussed that at different times, but I think that's very important, and I'm very happy that this exchange takes the form of, once again, two cross conversations, which is two cross views from practicing architects and critics into the exhibitions that happen on the room next door, almost something like that. So we are here on this first session, very happy to share, God knows whether by chance or for whatever other reason, space with time, more than space really, with the exhibition of Eduardo at Casa da Arquitectura. And it's quite clear that you're all here and the room is packed because of Kenneth Frampton and Eduardo Souto de Moura, so that they don't really need an introduction, but its courtesy requires a little bit of a few words to frame the conversation very briefly. So I'd like to say that Kenneth Frampton is first of all an architect, a critic, a historian, and also an educator. I started by saying he's an architect, not only because he trained as an architect and he practiced as an architect for a short while, or for a while, and we'll discuss whether it's short or long, but he practiced. But I think that he always kept his eye of an architect when discussing architecture. I have to say on a very personal note that the first thing that I read of Ken was the history of the critical history, the modern architecture critical history, like almost everyone in this room under 60 at least, that was a main reading text that actually, and I thought it amusing, but whatever. But it was when, I think it was in the third year that I came across your writing at Perspecta, which was 10 years or 15 years earlier on the Maison de Verre by Pierre Chéreau and Bernard Vijvoet, which I really fell in love with your way of describing architecture. I think I saw an architect talking about other architects. He had redrawn all of together with some other people, not by himself, but redrawn for the first time the project to an amazing level of detail with beautiful plans, sections, axonometrics and things. And the comments were not that of a critic or a historian, but that of an architect. And I think that's very important. On the other hand, I think also his work as an educator, he's a professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, if I'm not mistaken, at Columbia University in New York, is always mixed also with his activity as a critic, as a historian. So some of his most relevant publications, including the studies in tectonic culture, come from cycles of teaching programs at Columbia. And I think this combination of what he teaches and what he researches and what he produces is also something very important. Coming to what brings us here tonight, I think, and I have a question about that for later to Kenneth Frampton. I remember in my view, probably the first time, if not exactly literally the first, but that Kenneth Frampton wrote about Álvaro Siza was in the fantastic book of the Quaderni de Lotus for Electa, Professione Poetica, Poetic Profession, which in my view, I have to say, continues to be, if not the best, one of the best publications on Siza's work. Of course, it finishes at a certain time or a certain moment in time, but continues to be an exemplary way of addressing a work which is not easy to bring to paper, I think. And the main essay in that book was by Kenneth Frampton. And since then, which that's mid-1980s, he has continued to accompany the work of Álvaro Siza at the personal level with, I understand, a strong friendship with the man, and writing and lecturing and whatever many times. So please join me in welcoming, well, before that, I have to say that Kenneth Frampton has been too generous, and he prepared a little bit of a talk instead of just opening up a conversation as we had initially planned. So he's going to show a few slides with some comments. We didn't want to call it a talk or a lecture, but to initiate probably a series of possible conversations. And I thank him for that. And please join me in welcoming Kenneth Frampton to Serralves.
Good evening. What Carlos didn't say is that I am, how can we put it? I'm digitally challenged person, and yes, I mean, I never really mastered the art of typing, amongst other things I didn't master, and so there are kind of sometimes unfortunate events, such as the fact that I didn't understand quite what I was supposed to do here, and being altogether too passive or too preoccupied, at the last minute I wrote something, which I'm not going to read, I'm not even going to refer to it that much, and I'm going to just use images, because, well, first of all, I mean, I should have said, and that's already in the wrong order, that I'm very honored to be here and to be invited by Carlos Muro and by Philip Verne and by Nuno Grande to participate in this event. But yes, though I was only too happy to say yes, I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do, and that's to do with the digital incapacity, in as much as the attachment that explained what I should do somehow was never printed out, so I never quite understood. So at the last minute, I decided to write a piece and so on. But I'm ignoring that piece. I'm just using the images that the piece provoked, basically. And of course, I'm still a bit stuck with that moment when I wrote this essay, with the title "Poetic Profession," and since then, Álvaro Siza has produced so much work that I am not in. Yes, I mean it's an overwhelming creativity, I think, and it would take quite a long time and to really understand this really protean production. So I'm going to focus mainly on just a few remarks about the early work, and I should also start with this image, I think. Yes, there it is. Okay, it's right in front of me. Anyway, this is the cover of a Skira book, which is a collection of Álvaro Siza's writings in English, and it's of course somehow or other, I suppose, a kind of auto-portrait of himself. One's not quite clear whether he's beginning to draw something or write something, which is, there is this dimension of both drawing and writing, and this book is of course devoted entirely to his writing, but also illustrated with drawings. And it's a very much, I'm fortunate enough to have a copy of this book, which is was sent to me by Álvaro and dedicated to me, and it's a prized possession because it is very touching and an illuminating book, and it also has, and that's what I started to write in the longer piece, has something of well, it touches on his aphoristic way of thinking, I think, and it touches a little bit on what I would still think of as a kind of very strongly existentialist way of being, in a way. And so these two things, I think, are woven together in this book. And the emphasis in the writing is on the drawing, of course, and maybe there is a kind of constant oscillation between the two. And this emphasis upon drawing, you could say almost a compulsive aspect to understand the world through drawing, understand and communicate to oneself and to the world at large through drawing, and to, of course, to builders and to other architects. And it's one of the things that fascinates me, this relationship between draftsmanship and craftsmanship. I think that's very evident in all of Siza's work, this kind of conversation between draftsmanship and craftsmanship. And so that although there is a very powerful command of form, there is also always, I think, this the way the form is clad the way steps are detailed, the way doors, windows, all these things are detailed are a very strong part of the way in which he thinks. And then there are these, sorry, no, it's okay. There are these, well, there is this extraordinary drawing of this gentleman who's sitting on my left here when he was much younger, of course. But I think of it, it hadn't occurred to me before that it's very much in the style of Oskar Kokoschka's drawing of Los, in fact. Particularly with regard to the eyes and the fact that the eyes are, they are viewing something that is very far away. It's a very touching image, I think. And then there is this, vis-a-vis this question of the existential and the importance of drawing, because there is this business of the person who is drawing also is drawing himself drawing, and here, you know, actually this drawing reminds me of Bruce Chatwin's book, which has the title "What Am I Doing Here?" You know, because I think anyone who's traveled around a bit and found themselves invited in strange places, and ends up in a room like this with I don't know, this same kind of yes, a sense of wonder and isolation, you know, that this drawing implies to me. And but vis-a-vis draftsmanship, craftsmanship, I've always liked this staircase. It's a very early work, it no longer exists, but this question of celebrating a staircase, celebrating the movement of the stair, but also the movement of the human subject on the staircase. And the other dimension, I think, which is perennial in Siza's work at many different levels, I think, is this idea of topography. I mean, here, of course, it's all important, but what is fascinating about the drawing and the mode of drawing is this yes, is this way in which the site as given is regarded almost as though it is an inscription, a kind of archaeological inscription, or almost like an engraving that in a way has the project emerging from it, you know, and that I find to be an essential aspect of his creativity, certainly at this moment, but perhaps throughout his career, and so this, of course, it is the pool in Matosinhos, Lesa da Palmeira, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But so here one has a kind of later drawing, a quite different drawing, the kind of trial implantation of the work on the site, but surrounding this achievement are an endless sets of drawings which are constantly trying to gain out of the site, to understand the site, to invent the site. I mean, to paraphrase Liu Kang, I mean, I think it's a question of, you know, there's this famous kind of weird, enigmatic statement of Kang, what does the brick want to be? Well, you know, a very gnomic statement, but there is, you can say, you know, that there is in Siza's work this question of what does the site want to be, or what does the site want to be in relation to the building? It always fascinated me from the time I first saw this project that somehow or other the movement of the autoroute beside the site is also part of the way in which the site is thought of, the layering of the site and so on, apart from the pools themselves in the rocks. And yes, these two pools, this space of appearance, which I think the project, I've always been obsessed by this Hannah Arendt phrase, the space of public appearance. And I think this is one has, well, everywhere in many works by Siza, it's clearly evident, but here it's there right at the beginning. And there's something, I think, kind of archaic about this work in a way. And this image, which is by João Rodrigues, a photographer, and there is a whole story here about Siza's relationships to photographers and vice versa, and for that matter, the whole question of photography in relation to architecture, the way in which photography is both a record but also in a way a metaphor, I think. There is in other words, there is an intentionality to the work itself, but also to the photographer's perception of the work. And I think with this particular photographer that comes from this book, Siza on Siza, you feel it very strongly. I mean, again here, and I'm somewhat indebted to Yehuda Safran, who would associate this work with Appia, you know, the out of Appia, I think, very validly. So this is obviously, you know, a very heroic work. Of course, the sea here is a real challenge, both to bathers, for that matter. So much a challenge that it can't really be. You can't really enter it because of the rock formation, and it's a challenge to the architect, I think, as well. The other work that I've always found very touching is this work in Moledo Domino, this house which has so many things to be said about it, and I'm not going to belabor it here, but one of the things that fascinates me is the fact that it was for, you know, I think for a banker, I'm not sure. Anyway, for someone who's quite wealthy, this is a, you know, a weekend house. Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But what I find particularly touching, apart from the fact that there are references to Frank Lloyd Wright in this house, for example, it is really an effort to create a kind of weekend retreat without destroying the original work. So here it's a house that was previously part of a vineyard. And I remember that Alvaro told me this interesting story that, which I've always assumed was true, but maybe it is, has a certain mythic aspect as well. But in any case, the client, the rather prosperous client, was told by equally prosperous friends that since he'd bought this old vineyard and the house with it, that he should really tear all the vines out because they're all hopeless and buy and plant orange trees. You know. And I think the architect played a role in dissuading the client not to do that. And in fact, to maintain the vineyard, in fact, to revive the vineyard. And yeah, I find that fascinating that in a way in this case, the task of being an architect went beyond being an architect. It went towards, you know, the formation of the project itself at the most basic level in relation to much wider cultural issues, I think. And I've always been touched by this building because of the way, well, above all, because of these granite. I mean, well, maybe for someone who's lived their entire life in Portugal, it's kind of ridiculous reaction. But I mean, the granite posts which support the vines, you know, and create this little portal to the swimming pool are for me extraordinary elements from the past, and which very much determine, I think, the character of the work. And so there are fascinating things about this building. The relationship to the work of Wright, of course, in a way, is present here, and this arch made out of granite posts that gives into the swimming pool. You know, is here, of course, covered in vines once more, much more decoratively than before. And so. What fascinated me and still fascinates me here in this bank building in where is it, for God's sake? I've forgotten. Diazim, right? Yeah. Well, of course, what is fascinating about this, I think, is this rather unusual use of regulating lines, and well, not the regulating lines of Le Corbusier, but the regulating lines of vectors that are sort of seen as latent in the site, and so what I find fascinating about this work is the way in which the organic form of the work is determined by these vectors, but the syntax is a kind of rereading in a way of the legacy of the modern movement, and inside, of course, is well, you can say there are many aspects of the legacy of the modern movement here, which runs from the constructivist architects, Dutch constructive architects of the 20s to Aalto, of course, is very present in this work, and so this work will also lead to another work, another bank, in fact, which also has and will get, and I was very much involved with this, the first prize for the European Prize for Architecture, and 1986, I think, and 88, yeah, sorry, 88, okay, and but the work which really fascinates me is this work in the Birish house in Pavot d'Ovazim, which was once called by people who were involved with it and with the office in this early phase, the bomb house, because it looked as though it was a house that was a cubic house that had a bomb put in it. And what I find fascinating about this house is its relationship to tradition, in fact. What impressed me enormously is the fenestration, which for an outsider you think it must be of steel, but it's not. It's of wood, and probably now not possible to achieve. But it fascinates me, this mixture of casement and hinged openings, and what am I doing here? Yes, it's not going forward anymore. No, I should do it there. That's right. Okay, and so I find this a fascinating work, and here, with many mixed languages in it, here, of course, relates to the hardline modern movement of, let's say, Dutch Neue Zakelijkheid architecture, and what is most fascinating of all, of course, is that an outsider would think that this fenestration is out of steel, but of course it is out of wood, and involving also a very strange idea about regulating lines. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, yes. Regulating lines. Too many pieces for me. And yeah. So, and then I think it's it's an extraordinary work, because this work also reminds me somehow of the Maison de Verre, although I'm not saying it's in any way influenced by the Maison de Verre, but it has this, so many pieces move in this house. The light of the house suggests this work, I think, and yeah. Where at the same time, of course, it is referring to many things at once. I mean, the delicacy of the fenestration makes one think, an outsider, to think that it must be metal. And at the same time, of course, inundated with vegetation. So it's both a modern work and it's both a modern work that is, as it were, disappearing. And this range of the architect, the way this architect can, I mean, it fascinates me that this, the early building of the School of Architecture, the Ramos Pavilion, I think, you know, related to the original foundation, and the way in which, shown here, the original old building at the bottom, and I think the Ramos Pavilion at the top. And very typical of him is this almost a sort of Wim Wenders-like figure that is floating over the site, you know. And this extraordinary kind of anti-perspectival courtyard. And of course the final work, and the buildings themselves, you know, taking on the character of personage, but the overall plasticity of this work, I still find very compelling. And I hope before I leave here, I will go and see it again in either tomorrow or the day after. What is fascinating, I think, about this, of course, is Melaguera. It's outside of Évora. It's this large housing complex. This drawing fascinates me because it's as though it's like an examination of the site. It's as though it's expecting the housing to sort of be induced. It's like an archaeological creation, I think. That strikes me as being, you know, exceptional aspect of this work. Oh, this is extraordinary photograph by Roberta Colliver of the site in its immediate gestation, which brings me to the last. And yes, this building in New York, which is now, I think, topped out, with an Indian developer client and a Portuguese architect on 56th Street, close to 11th Avenue. And it introduces, for me, a very interesting thing, because it really is, I think, relating back to the modern movement. In fact, it's not at all identical, but it seems to me that there is some connection here, however unconscious, to the PSFS building in Philadelphia by Howe and Lescas of 1936. And so, in a city which is now in a way being eaten alive by high-rises, one high-rise more boring than the next, one high-rise more meaningless than the next, covered in curtain wall. This is, of course, many of them much higher than this building at its 35 stories. Many of these buildings are complete zero, basically. They're basically capitalism, neoliberal capitalism at its worst in terms of its building capacity, which of course can be found all over the world, and Manhattan is no exception. But this work stands out, and you know, it's a very rational work in a way. And I think one finds in Ziza's total production here and there works which are rational, are not particularly organic in character. And this range of the work is something that impresses me no end. And I think I will stop at this point. Thank you.
So, thank you for your brilliant words. I will change into Portuguese now because to introduce Eduardo, he will speak in Portuguese. So we decided to make this kind of a two-language conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Serralves Foundation for putting together, in the House of Architecture, for putting together this magnificent meeting between such distinct and meaningful personalities for our lives as architects, but also as citizens. It is my job to present Eduardo Souto de Moura, born in 1952. He looks good. And he was my professor at the School of Architecture. We were transitioning to the School of Architecture of the University of Porto, where he was a teacher between 1981 and 1991. He now is a full professor. Of course, at that time, he was a young assistant professor that I learned to admire, although we had some friction, I must confess, in the beginning. But the career, not just as an architect, but also as an academic, in a good sense of that word, of Eduardo Souto de Moura has been remarkable in universities such as Paris, Belleville, Harvard, Dublin, Zurich, Lausanne, Mendrisio, and now recently Mantova, invited by the Milan Polytechnic. So as we can see, an academic experience that I think has been advantageous for his professional experience, because he has been getting to know different professors, different colleagues. Jacques Herzog was here, whom he met in Zurich. So this international context, his relationship with both sides of the Atlantic, did open a work perspective, although he still loves to speak in Portuguese, but they have an international perspective that led the career of Eduardo Souto de Moura to go beyond the Portuguese and European areas. And also because it was always quite riddled with quality and even coherent, if you will. So it's a piece of resistance, if you will, and persistence, pertaining many of the things that Kenneth Frampton told us about, the way that architecture has been somewhat transformed into a bureaucratic, technocratic, neoliberal process of promotion. I'm not saying that Eduardo avoids this type of orders, but there is a persistence, a resistance in his work that is commendable. Even with the order, it's a pragmatic order, and I think that this has happened in the US and also in France, where it has been building a lot. So, bringing the work method and a persistence around the design and detail that becomes rare in many architectural definitions and in many ways of production. From the international point of view, I think that this persistence was recognized by the jury of the Pritzker Award in 2018 when they defined it, this way of working and looking into things not with nostalgia but with the cultural way of seeing the past, and the way that Távora and Siza with rehabilitating, bringing back many of the values of architects that were important for the history of architecture of the 20th century. You can go through this later, its connection with the history of architecture. And I think that we are all very proud of the award at the Biennial of Venice, not just in the same year that Kenneth Frampton gets awarded for his career as an historian and critic of architecture. A Portuguese architect is awarded, we don't know because of what work, because Francesco Dal Co is here, the beautiful chapel for the pavilion of the Vatican that might have been the last piece of strength. I want to believe that those were the two projects, not just the Diálogos Cruzados, but also the huge lesson that we get from the island of San Giorgio about the way that it's possible to work from materiality, tectonic, something that Kenneth Frampton loves, with a contemporary chapel of the 21st century. Maybe this is the main lesson coming from that project, and also São Lourenço Barrocal. It seems that the architect wasn't there, as is said many times, so building upon what Kenneth Frampton was saying before, what the place wants to be, and the Barrocal wanted to be a work by Souto de Moura. So all this brilliant path between the academia and the profession leads us to understand that some way the learning from Álvaro Siza was somewhat fruitful. Many times we bring the perspective of Eduardo as an apprentice of a master, a certain continuity, but it's a continuity deriving from heritage and heresy towards the teachings of the brief period that he worked with Álvaro Siza, because usually we think that they worked for a long time, but they didn't. Then they met again recently in works that they have together. But in that period, Eduardo can learn and apprehend that work method around the history, the location, the tradition, in a perspective of continuity, but also reinvention. So thank you for being here, and please tell us about your views about Álvaro Siza. That's why we're here today. First and foremost, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here in Serralves, and also thank you to the House of Architecture for these cross dialogues, and to be here sitting to the left of the architect, Kenneth Frampton, a global, universal reference and so important for the Portuguese architecture, started with Siza, with Távora, and then with the new generation that it's getting older, which is my own. Let me take advantage of Frampton being here, and Siza too. I brought 5 images that I would love to ask you some questions about them, since you're both here. I met Frampton in this book, in the English version. This is the Portuguese one, in '81. And I met Walter Benjamin, which is a German philosopher and writer, who wrote this beautiful text that everyone knows about it, and everyone shows this text. And for those who are not aware of it, it tells us about the angel of history, the new angel. And this angel of history flies between the ruins of history and tries to build them, but it becomes an impetus from heavens and cannot close its wings, so it goes to heaven and starts to refound the world. It's a beautiful image of the temptation of rebuilding, the temptation and the figure of the definite position of founding a new image and a new man, a new world.
Não vais lá e mudas.
Okay. So, Klee uses this text by Walter Benjamin with a set of designs of angels, where you can see them with the open eyes and a begging mouth. This is the image of the new angel. When I worked with Siza, during my course of architecture, I bought this book by Frampton, The History of Modern Architecture, and I saw Siza designing angels. And when they give me designs from Malgueira or São Vitor, in the middle of the ruins, there were angels. And I would ask myself, what's happening? So many angels. And then Prado Coelho published essays about angels. Then I made my military service, and then I brought the book of Rio with angels, and also Rafael Alberto about angels, I wasn't becoming a mystical person, but I was being disturbed with this angel inflation. This is after the revolution, and Prado has a very interesting text, tells us that the angel is the mythical figure that portrays a political impasse. But that's not the case. But I would ask myself, why Siza would draw so many angels? So we brought a plot, and no one knew who would design the project. So Távora, Rogério, Siza, and I, we decided to launch a tender. And at that time, I remember that we voted a certain debate with everything went along. Siza won the tender. We made a project. And then we had to go into details, and Siza made a brilliant exercise that left kind of a pseudo-democracy that the clients would decide where they wanted their windows. So we organized some charts, some sheets with my scheme of the floor, of the blueprint, and everyone would choose where the windows would go. Didn't mean that they would be exactly where they wanted, but they wanted a certain diversity. I remember that I chose 2 windows, one to the left to the river and one to the right to the sea. And he said, well, I don't want 2 windows. He told me, well, you're a new rich, so you want 2 windows. Why? But in those drawings, got some angels, okay, but just as Frampton showed, I didn't know, but it merges with the environment and the works. And those charts had a title that he was writing, said that it was Távora Angel. And he was right. I kept those charts. They are worth a fortune today. Then it said Eduardo Angel, Cavaco Angel, and then the angels were sexually endowed. They have different proportions in terms of sexuality. But then at the end, he wrote the Siza angel, so he confuses himself with the angels. So it's a factory in China of chemical products. Siza, if you want to say something, please do. To what extent it merges with the angel? What they get to understand that it's an angel, and then it becomes a purpose itself, and figuratively the work resembles the angel, and maybe the angel is the architect even. And this is quite clear, right? My question is, what to do? And the issue is, taking advantage of Frampton being here, what do these angels and the last works of Siza in China have to do with the critical regionalism?
Not much, I think. Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, well, you know, critical regionalism is, you know, this was an essay I wrote in 1983. You're still, you know, holding my feet to the fire, as they say. Yes. Well, I don't know, maybe there's no connection. Listen, I think this angel, Benjamin's angel, is quite clear about the present condition. And from this point of view, I think architecture is a kind of anachronism, you know, as are many other cultural endeavors in this moment in time. And particularly given the triumph of neoliberalism worldwide, you know, this idea of progress is, you can say that in many respects, the very idea of progress, which was an Enlightenment notion, has become synonymous with commodification, which includes commodification, of course, of everything. The environment, nature, everything. Everything is commodified. And so, you know, of course, the angel says, Benjamin Smith would like to close his wings and restore everything that's been destroyed. But he can't do that because the wind forces his wings open and drives him back into the future. I mean, that myth holds as much importance now, I think, as it held in 1936. From that point of view, the force of progress, the wind blowing him backwards, has not reduced at all. And Australia being a classic example of it, of recent days, I mean. So architecture, in a way, yes, it's a kind of expression of hope, I think, against against a kind of eclipse, in a way. I think that's where it is. I mean, this field, and it's been like this for a long time. I mean, Nuno showed me today this reply that Álvaro Siza made to me when I think it started out of a postcard, I think. My memory could be faulty about this, where I hear that he has a lot of work, and I say, you must be very happy with the amount of work you have, and so on. And he writes back to me and says, yes, it's true, I have a lot of projects, but I'm not happy. How can one be happy when Europe has no project? That's what he said. And that's a long time ago now, but I didn't think it really changed. It has not changed that scene. Yeah, that's my provisional response.
Well, England has a project. No, eu também tive uma etapa.
I also had an obsession with angels because of Halo, because of Reminders. I always thought that Siza's angels are connected beyond Benjamin, have to do with, when I was studying angels for real, it has to do with the ability of angels according to theologists, quite known theologists. They can see the past, present, and future. So I always thought that Siza, I think he has this ability, but if he wasn't, or if he didn't, he would be looking for it. But trying to make this conversation broader, thank you for your question.
I'd like to go back to Kenneth Frampton with a very simple question that for me it's also very important, and perhaps some people might share it. In terms of interest, I was referring before to the Poetic Profession book, which is, I think the first edition is 1986, and I think that perhaps you had published, correct me if I'm wrong, but because I didn't have time to double check all of your list of writings, but you had already published one short writing, an essay on Siza in Casabella before, or something like that, but I'm not certain. But so this is mid-1980s, which is somehow, to some extent, late already in Siza's career. And I'd like you to tell us, how was your first encounter with Siza's work? How did you come to get to know his work? And what was the real, more personal, emotional impression? What did you find in him that was really a revelation, if it was, or a discovery? Or because I think that's something, because since then you've accompanied his work for more than 30 years in a very intense way, but I'm very curious if you want to share that. It's almost a personal question, but I think it's one of those things that are so personal that can be precisely shared in public. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, it's working. Okay. Yes. Well, of course, I guess I have to say I'm indebted to Bernard Huet, the late Bernard Huet, editor of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, who publishes very early, I think in 76 maybe, I don't really remember. Well, it's an issue on Alvaro's work, and I don't remember that either, but an appropriate quotation from Fernando Pessoa, and I found this work extremely stimulating and refreshing, and yes, very sensitive and sensitively articulated and so on. This is, I suppose, the beginning of this interest, yes. And then, you know, there were certain figures like Wilfried Wang, of course, and José Pau de Santos, who, and then through this connection, this kind of Chinese Anglo Portuguese connection, I meet Eduardo Souto de Moura. I see the early works of the early gardens of Eduardo Souto de Moura and the early houses, and I have a very yes, I have a fond memory of two works. One of which is the Beerish House, where the surprising thing, which is maybe I'm repeating myself, is that those windows, which I assume were metal, you know, but that kind of that skill in making wooden windows, which probably now cannot be achieved anymore. I mean, that was a big revelation to me, and along with the strange combination of sash windows and casement windows, and the way in which this combination of sash and casement had something to do with the history of Porto in relation to Britain. At least this is the myth I was told, and of course I bought this myth, which is that sash windows came, you know, as ballast on ships that went back with port and sherry to the self-indulgent British, and it's a story I like in any case. So I kind of bought into it, and I still buying into it. But I think what was interesting at that time was that Eduardo was doing these, you could say, Mysian houses, but with masonry, with these little pebbles inserted into the masonry, you know, in a very kind of delicate and, yes, clever way. Craftsmanship, of course. In both cases, that's, I think, interesting to look back at those pieces, is that you probably cannot find carpenters anymore that could make the windows of the Beerish house, and probably the masons that could make this kind of stone wall also no longer are alive. So it was an interesting moment, I think, in Portugal, culturally, of course, but also politically, I think, you know, obviously the case. It really impresses me that after the famous Portuguese Spring, in the book Ziza by Ziza, Carlos Sioni and Rodriguez are talking to him about Évora and Malagueira and the building thereof, and by a communist municipality, of course, you know, and the tension between the revisionist government in Lisboa and the communist government in Évora, I mean, is part of the story of that work, I think. And well, I know it seems to be the case. The record is such. So that's I've gone beyond, of course, what you asked me, basically. But yes, that's it.
And now I would like to ask something to Eduardo, building upon what we are talking about today, the connection with the heroes. You want to say something? Of course. Please do. Let me just say that that picture with the work in China is connected with the critical regionalism, or it has to do with what I believe were the purposes and also the consequences of the action of criticism teaching of publications of Kenneth Frampton. Let me tell you why. When I began as an architect, you wouldn't hear about architecture in China. No one would talk about architecture in China. Ancient China, okay, but... And after a short period in the 30s, no one would talk about Portuguese architecture also. And in the book of critical regionalism, we go through what was called at that time the periphery, and the action of Kenneth Frampton is connected with going around the world, showing, recording, criticizing, exhibiting, disseminating what happens in the periphery. Because what architecture publications would show, and well, even books, known books about the history of modern architecture, about the modern perspective, would be Milan, Paris, London, New York, maybe, I think, and that was it. The rest of the world was periphery. So I think that Kenneth Frampton was among many other things, was an agent for globalization. Globalization in the sense of a choir of the healthy aspects of globalization. Let me highlight this. Many things were valued, known, the influences and the exchanges in a much more broader and fruitful sense via the action of Kenneth Frampton and others. But he is one of the main persons that brought forward this globalization. So I believe that he done this task of going throughout the world for the globalization brilliantly. Let me finish by saying, if I hadn't been known, partly because of many writings by Kenneth Frampton about myself, about Portugal, not just about me, of course. If that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been called for a project in China. So it has to do with critical regionalism, of course.
A viagem do regionalismo crítico para o centro.
So, let's go to the center of the world, which is China. China is not the periphery, it's the center of the world. Yes, China is known. It's known by ancient architecture and colonial architecture. It has some quality to it, of course, not the modern architecture of China. We will come to the idea that China had stopped. As pertains to Portugal, that was the consensus. Portugal is stalled. Nothing comes from it. And something would come here and there, but very small things that we could only see with a very, very generous lens. And that's what happened. I'm sorry. When you got to China, you know, Hangshu is the architect who is trying to resist against this neoliberal China of two systems. He was the Pritzker Prize of China, and he clearly represents his perspective of critical regionalism, taking upon the heritage of China, keeping it as an element of contemporary architecture. I know that you built a building with Hangshu, yes, next to it. To what point do you see yourself in Hangshu's work, that resistance that I was talking about in the global logics of building architecture? I did see a will, a desire of escaping the commercial production of China. You see kilometers and kilometers of buildings in height, international style, if you will, or with some hints of post-modernity to have evolved. And so in materials, the project that I know is a campus. It's a connection of different parts and material things, the expression. And the evidence of knowledge of information, direct or indirect, but I'm sure it was directly in that case, of architecture that happens in this planet by selecting, choosing, etc., but with an openness, and this with more or less effectiveness or pertinence, if you will. It's what happens, in my opinion, quite positive. There is no center in periphery. There is a world where you do good and bad, and where we can debate ideas. But I will shut up now because you are here. You are the ones working here, so please. Well, from your presentation, I got to understand that this new oriental stage of Álvaro Siza means a change in its work, right? I'm happy that it's not critical regionalism anymore. What I love in Siza is the ability that he has of following the evolution of the world, of problems, answering those problems. That's what I admire the most. After Távora, he was a regionalist, and then he met Álvaro Alto, that was never a regionalist anymore. Then he went to Rus, and so on and so forth. So in China, he met a different world, a global world, but I don't see any regionality to it. But my admiration has to do with a sense of smartness. The handbooks say it's the smartness, it's the ability to adapt to new situations. The world changes and he adapts, and he does things properly, and he's always young. That's an adjective. That's why I love him. It's the intelligence that he shows in that discovery of heroes. That Siza discovers Alto, which is not a reference for Távora. Eduardo, and I remember when I was your student, Mies is a constant reference, I know. I remember you told me about conversations you had with Álvaro Siza about your preference of Mies. Yes, Siza was amazed when I said that my favorite architect was Mies. He asked me to make a presentation in Gulbenkian in Lisbon, and asked me, can you go there and talk about Álvaro Alto? And I said, yeah, sure. And then he said, well, tomorrow we'll have dinner and I want to know what you're about to say. And we had dinner in that nice restaurant in front of the office. What's the name? Okay. And then I said, Álvaro Alto was an amazing guy, but it was not part of my heroes because he was connected with regionalism. So Portugal just came out of a revolution. So the radical modern movement based in iron, like Frampton was saying, in new technologies, in industrialization, that we had to build 500,000 homes, 2,000 schools, And the postmodernists or regionalists would not do it. So I said, Álvaro is an amazing guy, but I don't think it's timely. I'm not interested in him. So what do you like? And I said, Mies van der Rohe. And he said, what? Mies van der Rohe? But that guy just designed some glass homes, no one can live there. And then with the evolution, me, myself, started to get interested in Mies, not because of the archetypes of the houses, but because of the contradictions. And the contradictions, he would lie like all architects do, saying that the beautiful is in the truth. And he would completely neglect details in order to make beautiful works. So I made a lot of conferences about Mies, not about heroic periods and ideological convictions, but also because of the hidden side of Mies, because that's the salvation of architects, having to change to reach the beautiful. And you think that Álvaro Siza ever forgave you about this? I would never discuss this anymore. No, when he won the award of Van der Rohe, he spoke about that again for Latin America. And I think that he was awarded in Calacasa, in that amazing home. It was kind of a pavilion in Fensor. And I think that's where Siza and Herzog were awarded. And then he got here and he... First, when he won the first award of Van der Rohe, he said, Eduardinho, I won an award that I'm sure you would love. I said, of course I would, because of the award, and then because of the name. And then we had... He was very excited, the Maison Carrée of Álvaro in France. Said it's an amazing thing that he knew from books, for Bonova, for the stairs, or this and that. But then, when he saw it, he said, it's amazing. It's an amazing house. So, 15 days after, we went to Maison Carrée. And then Siza gets awarded with Mies van der Rohe Award in Chicago, next to Chicago. And then he said, what about Maison Carrée in Fensor? And said, Eduardo, come on. If you see Maison Carrée, no one can live there, right? And all of a sudden, we have some humor with our friendship and some friction, of course, but it's a healthy friction, if you will.
So,
ainda bem que ele vier.
Realmente, eu e de certa maneira a minha geração.
Yes, my generation and myself here in Porto, there was no interest starting with the masters of Mies van der Rohe. Of course, that I couldn't have more respect and appreciation for the architect, but there was no following of this architect because it was a different direction to it. One thing that I assessed later was that at the time Mies van der Rohe, Eduardo was still a boy. Mies van der Rohe wasn't a character that would be debated a lot in schools. But Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't also. Frank Lloyd Wright got known here via Godinho for a very simple reason, because he married a Dutch woman and he lived in the Netherlands, and that was it. But the affinity or things in common between Wright and Mies, and one that impressed me a lot from the start is that both have buildings where there is a core and then they unfold via long walls. In the case of Wright, they are born from fire, from a central fireplace, and then to the pretty house, to the landscape, this way, that way, the other way. But Mies van der Rohe also shows this in other works
E depois
And then I
lembrei-me
remember that
que
Mies
o
van der Rohe
Ministro
had
Vos teve
at the
no
atelier
ateliê
of Wright.
do Wright. Eu suponho
I
que eles não
suppose
tiveram
that they
uma
didn't
muito boa,
have
uma
a
ótima relação,
great
mas de
connection. The
facto é que
fact
se
is that
conheceram
they met
e por alguma razão
and
fui visitar.
they visited, Mies went to visit the atelier. So
Isto é, pessoas com
people
linguagem
with completely
completamente diferente
different languages
podem ter
can actually have, can
seguir
follow
caminhos que se
paths
aproximam,
that are
embora com uma
common,
linguagem
although they have a
diferente.
different language to them.
E eu reparei, mas foi hoje que estive a tentar
And today I was trying to prepare myself for tomorrow
a casa do
of the Schinkelhaus, who designed, that Eduardo designed. He was still a boy at the time, but
menino, como dizia o menino,
like Niemeyer said,
fez
menino,
a casa exatamente há
and there is a core,
como culpa,
and then arms coming out of that core that Mies van der Rohe and also Wright. Maybe that's why Mies van der Rohe, I became also appreciative of Mies van der Rohe. But what I do love is the houses in Berlin, in brick by Frank Lloyd Wright.
So, I think Carlos is explaining you. And I have a question for Kenneth Frampton, because we were discussing how Mies can also be seen from this perspective of the relation with history, tradition, and how you were talking about how Eduardo made his first houses using traditional stone from Portugal, and we can see some regionalism approach here. So in a way, do you think Eduardo solved this problem of internationalism versus regionalism by picking or becoming a kind of Portuguese Mies van der Rohe?
Well, I mean, those works are very touching works at that moment. I think anyway, Eduardo's work has developed, I think, beyond that moment, and by a long way. And so, you know, I think in a way the of course, this whole business of regionalism and putting the adjective critical in front of it, it has become by now, for me, of course, an embarrassment. And Eduardo was very aware of that. He keeps on giving it to me. And yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it is something of an embarrassment, but after all, I didn't invent the term in any case, but it was very useful, I think. It was one way. I mean, of course, it was a reaction to the whole, it was a reaction to the postmodern style, I think, that, on my part. And also, you know, of course, it's Alex Zonis and Leanne Lefebvre who coined this term in relation to Greek work. But I think in some ways, you know, this question of now, what of the language we might use now. I mean, there's obviously a multiplicity of languages are available, and I think what faces architecture and the society in a way is commodification, and one can think of many examples, anyway, perhaps not here, but elsewhere, in the States, of course, where, and in the UK also, where and France for that matter, where the profession and the building industry itself is becoming increasingly commodified. You could say also increasingly rationalized, I suppose. But the commodification arises out of the politics, out of neoliberalism, and I see, you know, okay, forget about critical regionalism, but I see in a way, you know, the work of the entire work of Álvaro, and for that matter also Eduardo, is resistant to commodification. And so the specific differences in the language are less important than the resistance to the commodification. I think that in that sense, architecture, the only possibility for it in a way to continue, it is resistant. It's clearly not a dominant mode. The modern project, as it once was in the 30s, is obviously not. It's not possible to, and I think the entirety of Siza's discourse, both as architect but also as writer and as thinker, recognizes that and has always recognized that. So the question of the specificity of the language that is chosen, I think, is less important than the position of the architect towards, the total situation. I think that's what is a lasting and so whether one calls it critical regionalism or whatever, it's less important than the resistant capacity, I think, the resistance to the commodification.
Eduardo, estive para preparar
To prepare our conversation, I was reading an interview, a talk you had with Siza, I think it was in 2005, for a publication on the Medal of UF for the, I don't know if you remember this, from 2005, more or less. Well, no problem. There are many things. I loved your interview a lot because it's... yes, more or less. It's almost it's almost like a Truffaut Hitchcock interview. It's a younger architect asking things to an older architect. And there are two things that were very important, which is the position of Eduardo, asking about windows, the windows in Siza's work, and issues in the angle of windows. And you ask, because of a difficulty to design windows, which is a difficulty that I think that all architects face. It's not sharing a difficulty, it's asking how do you design windows. And one other thing is the amount of references that you are trying to find in projects. This is Arte, this is Sterling, this is Law, trying to see the surprise here. So maybe in Rivera's Maze, I thought it was very interesting. Coming back to this, in this history of references and continuities, if in this chain of masters, right, Le Corbusier, Mies, Aalto, maybe later Kahn, etc., Siza is fully aware, and we can all identify, right, Le Corbusier, Aalto, and Mies was not there. Wasn't because Eduardo. Isn't this a reason for you to choose Mies because Siza was not interested in Mies? Is this a way of this influence? I don't think so. I don't think so. The thing I admire the most in Siza, it's how difficult it is for him to make architecture. It's problematic for him. This is amazing, and he develops infinite ways of discovering how to do things. And a person such as this, it's impossible to influence, because I will not get a reference from someone who's in problems. Right? He's facing a lot of problems. That's the first point. Second, there's a very important factor also of why I was interested in Mies van der Rohe. As many rich characters, there are two, or many Mies van der Rohes. First, we had 68 years of postmodernity. So when postmodernity came here, there is a certain euphoria in Lisbon of postmodernity, of columns, Siza, Álvaro, Costa, I was younger, there was a text refusing interest in this exhibition on postmodernity, explaining that we have 48 years of postmodernity. We almost said that we were doing a quaterras and that was forbidden, okay? So we didn't do it out of shame. Second, as I was studying, I mean, not studying, observing is a way of studying, Mies van der Rohe, was to understand the contradictions that he has and the trauma. There's a continuous trauma that he never defined or never chose if he was classic, well, not classic, classicist, if you will, taking the rules of classic architecture, pure forms, closed angles, principles of symmetry, and the fragmentation, which is the neoplasticism, which is fragmentation. And that's very interesting, that excitation, that oscillation, if you will, that insecurity, this demand of oscillating between one thing and the other. So, I'm not here to talk about me, I'm here to talk about Siza. When I didn't care about me as a reference, the archetype, I became interested in the method. What I love about Siza is the method. I cannot copy the bomb house, but this persecution of Siza to subjects, to essays, to solve his problems. That's why I'm always very interested in what he does, because of his method. Just one reference. I read a book, a wonderful book, by Peter Anko, the Nobel Prize, called Poem. What's the name? Poem. I just forgot the title, but I'll remember soon. It's a very small book about permanence. The poem of what lasts, of what stays, and he explains what it is. There is a certain resistance to Peter Anko because he supported Serbia in the Kosovo War, but it might have written by the problems of a writer, similar to an architect, in the fixed locations where he mentioned that are poor things, not works of art. He lived in a corner around Paris in a very normal square with a creek in the woods. And how does he build that world that is perennial, that is useful for his safety and the safety of the literature that he writes? That's an example for architects because it is so simple. And that's what I'm interested in, Siza. How does he take the matchboxes and he draws like this, like that? Bring me a photocopy of this. We had homework saying we have a tender to the south of Naples. We need a building that cannot be a German rationalism. This is Italy, the south of Italy, so we need to have a Terrano. But there are some Baroque things that Italians do, that the buildings are not going outwards. There is kind of an exchange, a passage, and this and that. That's what I'm interested in most. It's the difficulties that he faces. And I'll shut up now.
We were talking about how we can use history, or how can we be historicists today without being labeled as dangerous postmoderns. We were talking about that yesterday. Do you consider that what Álvaro does and Eduardo does, it's a modern, it's still a continuity of modernism, or it's a postmodern condition, treating modernism in a very uncomplexed way and referring to these modern heroes, but in a playful way? So, do you think we can consider them as late modernists, still believing on this kind of heroic architecture, or in another way, postmodern architects using modernism as one reference more, as they could go, as they do, to classicism or to the other periods of architectural history?
You're asking me.
Asking you.
Yeah. Is it working? Yes? Yeah, okay. Well, it's a huge... you could say that in some sense architecture is an anachronism altogether, and that although building as a necessity continues, and I think that one of the interesting things for so-called ordinary people is this question of what is the difference between builder and architect. This whole question of what is, what are these two fields, and what exactly is an architect in relation to what exactly is a builder. I think that's still a problem of sorts. I mean, in terms of what, the interesting thing about China and the Orient altogether, Asia, is that until the 20th century there was this figure of architects simply didn't exist. There were master builders, no architects. And also, of course, in the medieval period here in Europe and so on. I mean, it's the same. You had master builders, but you didn't have architects. So that, in a way, the whole field is linked to the Enlightenment and to the progressive aspects of bourgeois culture, I think. And it's clearly that it seems to me that the techno-scientific development plus triumphant capitalism, in a way, has created a kind of crisis for architects. Since what is the role of architect? You can see with mega cities, for example, that the city, except where it is grounded in historical formations, as here, for example, in this very city, for that matter, still can be conceived and up to now sustained, But it's clear that in larger mega cities all over the world, the idea of what is a city is completely gone. It cannot be related to the historic idea of what is a city. It fascinates me that somewhere Álvaro Siza talks about, the attempt on the part of Porto municipality to liven up the historic city with some kind of artificial entertainment. This predicament is. It's not going to go away. And I think that at its best, this profession is able to provide some other worldview, some other micro condition, which is other than the total commodification. So I think that, for instance, if one takes Manhattan today, there's just one high rise after another. They are really kind of destroying the place, of course, because they have no meaning except profit. There is no other meaning to these works. And I mean, the interesting thing about Mies is that I think he tried to create a kind of architecture degree zero, which could, as it were, sustain itself in a capitalist situation, would have some kind of significance. But today, that if you take all the high rises that are being built in Manhattan have nothing whatever to do with the vision of Mies van der Rohe, nothing whatsoever. So even a so-called modern city like Manhattan is in a way being eroded by commodification. I mean, it's just how it is. So an architect in that sense is a kind of, at best, a sort of holding operation. It's some alternative to the total commodification of the society. I don't know, that's how I see it.
Do you think that the building that Álvaro is designing in Manhattan goes back to this tradition of a kind of...
very interesting, yes.
Not ground zero, but a kind of a author zero logic, which doesn't want to scream in the city, but just wants to stay there and be part of a
well,
realm.
I think it's a building that tries to sustain some value other than simply commodity. It's not it resists commodification. I mean, it's not covered in curtain wall for a start. The cheapest way to build a high-rise today, everywhere I think, but particularly in Manhattan, is to make the structure and cover it with curtain wall. I mean, the curtain wall is the cheapest thing you can cover a building with. And so it has a certain rationality, proportion, quality. I mean, this question of craft. Actually, recently, Renzo Piano gave a talk in Columbia, and he started to talk about beauty. And he said, we don't use this word anymore. He started to talk about or play with the Italian word bello, and he made the argument that this word is not just, it has not just an aesthetic aspect, it has also an ethical aspect that is built into the word itself. This was Renzo's argument. But, and I found that very moving and very valid, I think. And it was coupled with something else he said about details, for example, craftsmen. The well-crafted building is a value in itself. It's a kind of an element which gives, as it were, a kind of civic respect to a work, Mm-hmm. So I find this kind of language that he was using on this occasion, kind of compelling in a way. And I think, but it's clear, okay, let's forget about critical regionalism. But I think that an architect is by definition in a kind of resistance situation, because the dominant culture has no interest in any of that, and the triumph of the techno-scientific late capitalist machine is totally indifferent to these kind of values, I think. So, in that sense, I think architecture has this. It is a kind of resistant culture, really.
I think that we should take advantage of having Eduardo here, and especially Kenneth Frampton. If you have any questions, now is the time. One, is there any other?
Any questions from the room?
There's one over there, and sim, porque senão já vamos ter de.
I have a question for Eduardo Souto de Moura. I'm sorry if I'm not following exactly the subject. You were talking about the tender with Fernando Távora and Álvaro Siza for your first office. And Fernando Távora spoke about your project, saying that it was a Max Bill project. We were talking about references, and I never found it, so I could never found the project. I would like to ask you why he said it. Why did he say it was a Max Bill project? And what was it like? Who said it? Fernando Távora said, and I saw it said by Eduardo Souto de Moura mentioned this, that Fernando Távora said this. Maybe it was, I don't know. Max Bill is an artist that I deeply admire. I have a watch designed by him, actually, but I don't remember that reference. But Távora would get upset with Max Bill because he didn't like his radical approach. I don't remember the tender, I'm sorry. When you designed your office, no, it was not Max Bill. I was teaching, I don't know where, Zurich, or I don't know, and he said, "Oh, I see that you work in Switzerland." I remember that, and because I respected Tavora a lot, I didn't say that, well, you can see that you also completely missed. Swing and a miss for you. But I didn't tell him this because I respected him a lot.
No
more questions for Kenneth Frampton. Should we finish? Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Kenneth Frampton. Thank you, Eduardo.
And we see
E vemo-nos amanhã
each other
We
tomorrow.
continue tomorrow at
na Casa da Arquitectura. Thank you, everyone.
Obrigado.